Iran's unraveling. Day 20 of the conflict that is reshaping the Middle East, 20 days. That's all it took to fundamentally alter the geopolitical landscape of one of the most volatile regions on Earth. When this conflict first erupted, analysts and defense experts warned of a prolonged, grinding campaign, one that would drag on for months with no clear outcome. Instead, what has unfolded over the past 3 weeks has stunned nearly every intelligence community in the Western world. Iran, a nation that spent decades positioning itself as the dominant force in the Middle East, arming militias across 5 countries, holding the global oil supply hostage through its proximity to the Strait of Hormuz, and building a ballistic missile arsenal that kept neighboring governments awake at night, is now fighting for its survival on every single front simultaneously. This is no longer a limited military engagement. This is something far more significant. This is the systematic dismantling of a regional power structure that, however unstable, had held together for decades. And the question that defense analysts, world leaders, and intelligence agencies are now wrestling with is no longer, can Iran win this war? The question has shifted to something far more sobering. Can Iran survive it? The strike nobody saw coming. The Caspian Sea changes. Everything day 20 did not begin the way most observers expected. There were no strikes in western Iran, no bombardment of the Tehran corridor, no missile exchanges in the Persian Gulf. Instead, the most significant development of the morning came from a direction that shocked even the most seasoned military analysts: the Caspian Sea. Israeli Air Force jets, operating in airspace that many had considered fundamentally out of reach, struck Iranian naval vessels near the port of Anzali in the country's north. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the strategic assumption that Iranian military planners had built their entire rearguard doctrine around: the north is safe. For years, for decades, Iran's Caspian coastline was treated as untouchable. It sat deep inside the country, far removed from Israel's primary operational theaters, geographically shielded, close to Russian territory, and separated from the conflict zones by hundreds of miles of Iranian-controlled land. This was where Iran kept its reserves, its supply corridors, its warehouses, its breathing room. Military planners around the world recognized the Caspian region as Iran's strategic depth, the place where the country could absorb punishment from the west and south while resupplying and regrouping in the north. That assumption died on day 20. 5 large Iranian warships were reported destroyed in the strikes near Ansali. A 6th, smaller vessel was damaged. But the actual weapons destroyed, as significant as they were, matter far less than what the strike represents strategically. By demonstrating the ability to operate in northern Iran, Israel sent a message so clear it requires no interpretation. There is no safe depth anymore. Not in western Iran, not in Tehran, not in the south near the Gulf, and now definitively not in the north along the Caspian coast. Every Iranian military planner who built contingency strategies around geographic protection, around the assumption that certain parts of the country simply could not be reached, must now go back to the drawing board. Every calculation about supply lines, about safe zones, about where to store critical equipment, about where leadership can retreat if the major cities come under sustained pressure. All of it has been invalidated in a single morning operation. The Russian connection, an upgrade that never arrived. The Anzali strike carries a second layer of significance that deserves serious attention: what was actually on those ships. According to intelligence assessments reviewed by defense analysts, at least one of the vessels in the port was carrying drones and advanced electronic warfare equipment sourced from Russia. And more critically, this wasn't a routine arms shipment. This was a capability upgrade. Russia had reportedly been working in recent months to specifically enhance Iran's ability to fight and survive the kind of technologically superior campaign being waged against it. The upgrades included improvements to drone navigation systems, hardened communications infrastructure designed to resist jamming and electronic disruption, and refined electronic warfare components aimed at degrading the enemy's targeting precision. Put plainly, Russia was trying to help Iran adapt to a war it was losing. The Kremlin recognized that its partner's military was being systematically dismantled and moved to provide the kind of technological enhancement that might allow Iran to fight differently, more resiliently, more effectively. Israel intercepted that upgrade before it ever reached the battlefield. That is not a tactical victory. That is a strategic intelligence coup of the highest order, the kind that requires not just military capability, but deep, real time penetration of supply chains, logistics networks, and communications channels. Stopping a weapons shipment is one thing. Knowing exactly what's on the ship, where it's going, and ensuring it never arrives before the recipient even knows it was targeted. That's an entirely different level of operational intelligence. The numbers that redefine the scale of modern air campaigns. Step back from the individual strikes for a moment and absorb the cumulative picture, because the figures released on day 20 are, by any historical measure, staggering. According to combined assessments from American and Israeli defense authorities, more than 15,000 targets have been struck inside Iran since the opening of hostilities. The United States alone claims direct responsibility for over 7,000 of those strikes. Within that overall figure, approximately 70% of Iran's ballistic missile launchers have been neutralized. Roughly 80% of the country's air defense systems have been degraded or destroyed. Around 100 anti-aircraft batteries have been eliminated. Approximately 120 radar installations have been taken offline. Iran's missile production capability has been reduced to zero, meaning the country is no longer manufacturing the weapons it needs to continue prosecuting this conflict. And perhaps most significantly, an estimated two-thirds of Iran's entire military-industrial complex has been destroyed. These figures are not press release statistics crafted to boost public morale. Numbers of this magnitude, if even partially accurate, represent something that has no real precedent in the modern era: the near-complete dismantling of a regional military power in less than a month. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed the 7,000 target figure personally on day 20 and declared it the most intensive day of strikes in the war thus far. He added a warning directed specifically at Iranian leadership that deserves to be quoted in full spirit, if not in exact words. Holding a senior position in the Basij or the Revolutionary Guards has become, in his assessment, a temporary occupation. General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, offered a statement on day 20 that is worth parsing carefully. He noted that American forces are operating every day, deep inside Iranian territory. That is not a boast or a piece of rhetoric designed for domestic audiences. That is a definitional statement, one that marks the transition from a campaign of targeted precision strikes into something that now has the character of sustained, systematic strategic degradation. The goal is no longer to punish Iran into changing its behavior. The goal appears to be the permanent reduction of Iran's capacity to threaten the region at all. My gosh, Hormuz, America's Marines and the world's most dangerous waterway. While the Caspian strike dominated the morning headlines, the week's most consequential strategic development is taking shape in the south, in and around the Strait of Hormuz. The United States has deployed the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit into the Persian Gulf. This is not a show of force deployment. This is not a symbolic gesture designed to signal resolve without commitment. The 31st MEU consists of approximately 2,200 combat-ready Marines operating from amphibious assault vessels. The unit includes F-35B stealth fighter jets, assault helicopters, and MV-22 Osprey aircraft, a multi-domain force package purpose-built for rapid raids conducted from sea and air, capable of projecting power ashore with minimal warning and maximum effect. The specific scenarios being discussed among military planners and defense analysts center on a set of islands that most Americans have never heard of, but that control one of the most economically critical bodies of water on the planet. Karg Island is the centerpiece of these discussions. Approximately 90% of Iran's oil exports pass through or near Karg Island. Rather than destroying the island's oil infrastructure, a move that would send already surging global oil prices into historic territory, American strategists are reportedly weighing the option of physically seizing the island and using control of it as a direct bargaining instrument to compel Iranian compliance on Hormuz navigation. Other islands under evaluation include Keshem, Kish, and Hormuz itself, each of which contains missile infrastructure, attack boat facilities, underground tunnels, weapons warehouses, and sites that could serve as forward operating bases for sustained regional operations. The reason this has moved from theoretical planning to active operational consideration is that Iran's posture on the Strait of Hormuz has shifted from a tactical threat to something far more alarming, a declared permanent policy. Iranian officials are no longer speaking of Hormuz as a crisis lever, a pressure point to be applied during times of conflict and released when tensions ease. They are now speaking openly of a permanent new regime in the strait, one in which vessels pay fees and tolls for passage, one in which what was once recognized universally as international waters becomes, in Iran's view, a monetized Iranian resource, one in which the free navigation that has underpinned global trade for generations is replaced by Iranian-administered access rights. Washington cannot accept this. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of the world's total oil trade. A permanent Iranian stranglehold on that waterway is not a regional problem that can be managed through diplomatic channels. It is a slow-motion global economic crisis that, left unaddressed, becomes a sudden and catastrophic one. The American calculation, clearly visible in the deployment of 2,200 Marines, appears to be direct and unambiguous. If Iran will not restore free navigation voluntarily, and if any ceasefire agreement cannot guarantee it durably, then the United States will physically take control of the keys. Nurse. The energy war comes for everyone. The conflict's most economically consequential dimension exploded onto the world stage in the 48 hours leading into day 20, and its effects will reverberate for months. Israeli strikes hit gas processing facilities at Asaluyeh and Salmas in southern Iran, major nodes in the country's petrochemical production and export infrastructure. Supply pipelines, transport networks, and refining units were targeted with what defense analysts describe as exceptional precision. Iran's response was immediate and deliberate, and its target selection was revealing in ways that tell us a great deal about how Tehran now views the regional landscape around it. Iran fired 5 missiles at Ras Laffan in Qatar. Ras Laffan is not a military target. It is one of the most important natural gas processing facilities on the planet, a critical pillar of Qatar's economic identity and a significant supplier to energy markets across Europe and Asia. 4 of the 5 missiles were intercepted. 1 got through. Significant damage was caused. Fires broke out at the facility. The choice of Qatar as a target was, by any strategic logic, extraordinary. Qatar had not been a hostile actor toward Iran. Qatar had, if anything, maintained quiet channels of communication with Tehran, carefully avoiding full alignment with the anti-Iran coalition, threading a diplomatic needle between competing pressures. Qatar was, by regional standards, attempting neutrality. Iran attacked it anyway. The Saudi oil facility at Yanbu was also struck, temporarily halting oil shipments. Drone strikes were recorded in the UAE and Kuwait, targeting refinery and operational infrastructure in both countries. Iran's message to the entire region was stripped of any ambiguity. You allowed strikes against our gas infrastructure. We will strike everyone's gas infrastructure. This is no longer a military conflict. It is a full-scale economic war, and we are prepared to fight it on every front simultaneously. The Arab world's unified response. The regional reaction was faster and more unified than anything seen in the previous 19 days of conflict, and it represents a geopolitical realignment of historic proportions. Saudi Arabia declared that whatever remnants of trust had remained in its relationship with Tehran had been entirely and permanently destroyed. Qatar, the same country that had attempted to maintain diplomatic equilibrium, expelled all Iranian military and security personnel from its territory, ordering them out within 24 hours. Foreign ministers from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and 8 additional countries convened in Riyadh and issued a joint statement that carries both diplomatic and legal weight. The statement condemned Iran's strikes on oil facilities, desalination plants, airports, residential buildings, and diplomatic missions. It cited Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, the self-defense provision, as a formal legal foundation for the signatory nation's right to respond. It demanded that Iran cease its attacks immediately and unconditionally. It called for a halt to Iranian interference with navigation in the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb, and it formally requested an emergency session of the UN Security Council. 12 Arab and Muslim majority nations speaking with a single voice, citing international law, demanding Iranian accountability. This is not a diplomatic footnote. This is the collapse of the regional architecture that Iran spent decades constructing. The network of relationships, dependencies, intimidations, and implicit understandings that allowed Tehran to project influence across the Middle East while insulating itself from coordinated pushback. Energy markets registered the new reality without hesitation. European natural gas prices surged more than 30% in a single trading day. Crude oil pushed toward and in some reports beyond $116 per barrel. These are not abstract financial figures. They represent real-world consequences for ordinary people. Higher heating bills in Germany, higher fuel costs in the United Kingdom, inflation pressure in economies from India to South Korea. This war stopped being a Middle Eastern conflict some time ago. It is now a global economic event wearing military clothing. Europe's failure at a defining moment. There's an uncomfortable truth that needs to be stated without diplomatic softening. Europe has failed this moment. NATO allies have not joined the coalition. European nations, with a handful of partial exceptions, have issued carefully calibrated statements condemning both Israeli strikes on Iranian gas infrastructure and Iranian strikes on Gulf facilities, as if these two sets of actions are morally and strategically equivalent. The language is so balanced, so studiously neutral, that it communicates nothing of substance to anyone. More troubling still, France and Italy have reportedly been paying Iran for safe passage guarantees, essentially purchasing assurance that ships flying their national flags will not be harassed, seized, or attacked while transiting the Strait of Hormuz. To call this what it is requires plain language. This is the payment of tribute to a state that has been designated a sponsor of terrorism. It is appeasement dressed in the language of pragmatism. This has historical precedents, and none of them are encouraging. When democracies choose to buy off authoritarian aggression, rather than confront it, particularly at moments when the aggressor is already weakened, already under sustained pressure, already losing, they do not purchase peace. They purchase a delay. They preserve the problem, allow it to metastasize, and ensure that the next generation faces it at substantially greater cost. President Trump has publicly and repeatedly called for a formal allied coalition, a unified front modeled on the coalitions assembled during previous Gulf conflicts. European leaders have declined, citing legal ambiguities, domestic political concerns, and a collection of procedural objections that, assembled together, add up to a decision not to act. The window in which that inaction looks like caution rather than complicity is closing. Burning from within. Iran's internal crisis. The war is not only being fought in the skies above Iran, it is being fought inside the country's cities, fuel stations, and government ministries. The Basij, Iran's internal repression and crowd control force, the mechanism through which the regime maintains domestic control, is under direct and sustained targeting. Israeli strikes have eliminated Basij operatives at guard posts in western Iran, destroyed more than 10 Basij positions across the country in coordinated operational sequences, and taken out an Iranian Mi-17 helicopter at Sanandaj Airport. The strategic logic behind this targeting is clear and deliberate. The Iranian regime's survivability is not solely a function of its ability to withstand external military pressure. It is equally dependent on its ability to control the population it governs. A population that has for years been accumulating profound grievances, economic mismanagement, international isolation, documented state violence against protesters, a generation of young Iranians watching their futures evaporate under the weight of sanctions and authoritarian governance. Destroy the repression apparatus, and that accumulated pressure has nowhere to go but outward. The signs of internal fracture are becoming impossible to dismiss. Fuel rations in Tehran have been cut from 30 liters per day to 20 liters following strikes on fuel depots in Tehran and Alborz. A black market has emerged with extraordinary speed. Reports indicate that 10 liters of gasoline are now being exchanged for approximately 2 million tomans on the street. Businesses across major cities are closing early. Police officers have reportedly been observed retreating inside civilian-adjacent areas rather than maintaining visible posts. Unverified footage circulating on opposition-linked social media appears to show armed individuals firing from vehicles at Basij positions. Whether this specific imagery is authentic is impossible to confirm, but the fact that such footage circulates widely is believed by large numbers of Iranians and aligns with the general atmosphere inside the country that tells its own story about where public sentiment currently sits. The regime's response is revealing in what it communicates about the government's own assessment of its internal security situation. Officials are distributing weapons to volunteer loyalist networks. Temporary headquarters are being established in locations outside normal government infrastructure. Checkpoint density is increasing at tunnels, under bridges, and along major transit corridors. These are not the operational patterns of a government that feels confident in its domestic control. These are the contingency measures of a government actively preparing for the possibility that its own urban centers become contested territory. Asserts a harder hand on the Security Council. One of the most revealing developments of Day 20 came not from a battlefield, but from inside Iran's own leadership structure. Reports, not yet fully confirmed at the time of this writing, indicate that Hussein Degan, the former Iranian defense minister and a figure with deep roots inside the Revolutionary Guard's hardline faction, has been appointed to replace Ali Shamkhani as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council. If these reports prove accurate, the appointment carries significant implications for understanding where Iran's leadership intends to take this conflict. When a political system comes under existential military pressure, history presents two broad response patterns: accommodation and entrenchment. Accommodation involves moving pragmatic or diplomatic figures to the forefront, signaling openness to negotiated resolution, and creating the conditions for off-ramp conversations. Entrenchment involves doing the opposite, placing hardline security figures in positions of authority, signaling resolve and defiance, and preparing the population and the bureaucracy for continued conflict regardless of cost. The reported appointment of a Revolutionary Guard's hardliner to the Supreme Security Council is an unambiguous signal of entrenchment. The chaos and devastation of 20 days of strikes has not produced in Iran's leadership a movement toward flexibility. It has produced the opposite: a doubling down, a decision to fight through whatever comes next with maximum institutional rigidity. This matters enormously for anyone hoping this conflict ends at a negotiating table rather than through continued escalation. A regime that responds to the destruction of two-thirds of its military-industrial capacity by installing harder men in Security Council positions is a regime communicating clearly and deliberately that it intends to fight to the end, whatever that end eventually looks like. The nuclear shadow and Pakistan's umbrella. A scenario that would have been dismissed as fringe speculation 30 days ago has entered serious analytical discussions among defense experts and regional strategists: the nuclear dimension. The logic runs as follows. If Saudi Arabia enters this conflict at full operational commitment rather than as a peripheral participant, it may activate its long-standing and well-documented defense relationship with Pakistan. That relationship includes, according to many analysts, informal arrangements regarding Pakistan's nuclear deterrent, arrangements that might allow Saudi Arabia to shelter under Pakistan's nuclear umbrella in the event of an existential threat. No Pakistani nuclear weapons are moving, no formal public request has been made, no official statement from Islamabad has confirmed any shift in posture. But the fact that this scenario is now appearing in serious, credentialed analytical discussions, rather than being immediately categorized as conspiratorial speculation, reflects how dramatically the escalation architecture of this region has changed in 20 days. The Middle East has spent decades with a single, undeclared nuclear power operating within its borders. The introduction of Pakistan's nuclear capability into the regional strategic equation, even theoretically, even as a passive deterrent, would represent a structural change in the region's security architecture that would permanently outlast whatever settlement eventually concludes this particular conflict. The technology of this war is the preview of every future war. Beyond the politics, beyond the geopolitics, beyond the specific military balance between Iran and its adversaries, Day 20 of this conflict has confirmed something that defense establishments around the world will be studying for decades: The technology being deployed here is not the technology of the last war. It is the technology of every war to come. AI-directed drone swarms have been deployed against Basij roadblocks inside Iranian cities. Swarms of up to 200 autonomous platforms communicating with each other, with AI software identifying targets, processing decision chains, and coordinating strike sequences in seconds. This technology was first stress-tested in the skies over Ukraine. It is now operating inside Iranian city limits. That is not an incremental evolution. That is a qualitative leap in the nature of urban warfare. The Leonidas Directed Energy System, an American electromagnetic warfare platform, has been deployed in this theater, using targeted electromagnetic pulses to destroy the guidance electronics of incoming drones and missiles without firing a single conventional munition. It identifies airborne threats and neutralizes them by frying their control systems across multiple simultaneous targets. When the cost of an interception is the electricity required to generate a pulse, the economics of air defense change entirely. Israel has adapted its laser interception capability for airborne deployment, a pod integrated into aircraft that can intercept drones and small projectiles while in flight. Given that laser shots cost a fraction of a percent of what conventional interceptor missiles cost, this technology has the potential to make sustained drone warfare against a laser-equipped adversary economically non-viable. The American military machine has done more than win this campaign tactically. It has demonstrated, in live combat conditions, against some of the most sophisticated Russian-supplied defensive systems ever exported, S-300 and S-400 platforms, advanced Chinese radar networks, that its technological advantage is not theoretical. It is operational. It is proven. And against these particular systems, it has been decisive. The research. The picture that emerges. Connect all of these threads, the Caspian strike, the Hormuz marine deployment, the energy war, the Arab coalition, the internal fracture, the leadership entrenchment, the emerging nuclear discussions, and the technology demonstrations. And a single coherent picture emerges. Iran entered this conflict as a regional power with significant deterrence capability, a global proxy network, a robust ballistic missile arsenal, and the geographic leverage of one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. 20 days later, 2/3 of its military industry has been destroyed. Its air defense network is largely gone. Its missile production has ceased entirely. Its northern supply corridor has been interdicted from the air. Its internal repression forces are being systematically dismantled. Its regional neighbors, including nations that Iran once cultivated as partial allies or at minimum as non-hostile observers, have united against it in a formal coalition citing international law. Its streets are restless, its fuel is rationed, and 2,200 American Marines are sailing toward its coastline. The regime's response to this comprehensive degradation has been to appoint harder men to leadership positions and to simultaneously threaten every Gulf state in the region. This is the behavioral pattern of a power that has exhausted its good options and is now choosing maximum defiance as the only option remaining. Whether that defiance translates into a dramatic final move, a genuine attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz, a missile strike that crosses a threshold forcing American ground action, or an internal collapse that nobody has yet modeled, is the question that Day 21 will begin to answer. What is already settled is this. The Middle East that existed before this war will not exist after it. The alliance structures, the deterrence equations, the assumptions about geographic protection, the limits of Western military reach, the leverage that proxy networks can provide, the guarantees that certain supply lines are untouchable, all of it has been rewritten in 20 days. The Marines are closing in on Hormuz. The question is no longer whether the old order survives. The question is who gets to write what replaces it, and whether anyone in the international community is paying enough attention to ensure they have a voice in that answer. This script covers geopolitical and military analysis based on reported events. All figures and assessments cited reflect publicly available intelligence assessments and defense reporting.